The autumn mist clung to the rocky coastline of Maine like ghostly fingers reaching up from the churning Atlantic below. It was October 15th, 1887, when young Timothy Hartwell first laid eyes upon Blackwood House Orphanage, an imposing Gothic structure that seemed to emerge from the fog like something born from a nightmare. The three-story building loomed against the grey sky, its dark stone walls streaked with decades of rain and salt spray, while twisted iron gates stood like skeletal sentinels guarding the entrance to what would become his new home. Timothy, barely 8 years old, pressed his small face against the cold window of the horse-drawn carriage that had brought him from Portland. His parents had perished in the Great Fire that had swept through the lumber district just 2 months prior, leaving him an orphan with nowhere to go but this remote institution perched on the cliffs overlooking the sea. The boy's breath fogged the glass as he stared at the forbidding structure, noting how the windows seemed to watch him with dark, empty eyes. "Don't look so frightened, child," said Mrs. Abernathy, the stern-faced woman from the Portland Children's Aid Society who had accompanied him on the journey. "Blackwood House has been caring for orphaned children for over 30 years. You'll be well looked after here." But Timothy couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his stomach like a cold stone. There was something wrong about this place, something that made his skin crawl and his heart race with inexplicable fear. As the carriage wheels crunched over the gravel drive, he noticed that no children played in the yards, no laughter echoed from the windows, and an unnatural silence seemed to blanket the entire property. The carriage came to a stop before the massive oak doors of the main entrance, their surface carved with intricate but disturbing patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in Timothy's peripheral vision. Mrs. Abernathy gathered her papers and Timothy's meager possessions, a small cloth bag containing 2 changes of clothes and a wooden toy horse his father had carved for him, and stepped down from the carriage. "Come along, Timothy," she said briskly. "We mustn't keep the matron waiting." The heavy doors opened before they could knock, revealing a tall, gaunt woman dressed entirely in black. Matron Blackwood appeared to be in her 50s, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, and pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through Timothy as if he were made of glass. Her face was angular and sharp, with high cheekbones that cast shadows in the dim light, and her thin lips were pressed into a perpetual expression of disapproval. "Mrs. Abernathy," the matron said in a voice as cold as the October wind, "I trust your journey was satisfactory, and this must be the Hartwell boy." Timothy shrank back slightly as those pale eyes fixed upon him, feeling as though she were examining a specimen rather than greeting a frightened child. There was something predatory in her gaze, something that made him want to run back to the carriage and beg Mrs. Abernathy to take him anywhere but here. "Yes, this is Timothy," Mrs. Abernathy replied, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's been through quite an ordeal, losing both parents in the fire. I trust he'll receive the care and guidance he needs here at Blackwood House." "Of course," Matron Blackwood said, though her smile was as cold as winter frost. "We take excellent care of all our children. They learn discipline, obedience, and the value of hard work. Timothy will fit in perfectly with our little family." The word family sounded wrong coming from her lips, like a curse disguised as a blessing. Timothy noticed that her hands, which she kept clasped in front of her, bore strange scars across the knuckles, as if she had been burned or cut repeatedly over the years. Mrs. Abernathy completed the necessary paperwork quickly, eager to begin her return journey before darkness fell. She gave Timothy a brief pat on the head and a few words of encouragement before climbing back into the carriage, leaving him alone with the terrifying woman who would now control every aspect of his life. "Come," Matron Blackwood commanded, turning and walking into the orphanage without looking back to see if Timothy followed. "I'll show you to your dormitory and explain the rules." Timothy had no choice but to follow, his small feet echoing on the cold stone floors as they walked through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women whose eyes seemed to track his movement. The air inside the building was thick and oppressive, carrying the scents of carbolic soap, boiled cabbage, and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Timothy's stomach turn. Blackwood House operates on a strict schedule, the matron explained as they climbed a narrow staircase to the second floor. Breakfast at 6, morning chores at 7, lessons from 9 to noon, afternoon work from 1 to 5, dinner at 6, evening prayers at 7, and lights out at 8. There is no deviation from this schedule, no exceptions, and no excuses. They passed several closed doors, and Timothy strained to hear any sounds of children beyond them, but the silence was absolute. It was as if the building were completely empty, except for himself and the matron. "Where are the other children?" Timothy finally found the courage to ask. Matron Blackwood stopped so suddenly that Timothy nearly collided with her. She turned slowly, her pale eyes boring into his with an intensity that made him step backward. "The other children," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "are where they belong. You would do well to remember that here at Blackwood House, children are seen and not heard. They do as they are told without question. They do not ask unnecessary questions, and they certainly do not concern themselves with matters that do not directly affect them." Timothy nodded quickly, his throat too tight with fear to speak. They continued down the corridor until they reached a door marked Dormitory B. The matron opened it to reveal a long, narrow room, lined with iron beds, each covered with a thin grey blanket and a flat pillow. The windows were barred, and the walls were painted a sickly green color that seemed to absorb what little light filtered in from outside. "This will be your bed," the matron said, indicating the last bed in the row, positioned directly beneath one of the barred windows. "You will keep your possessions in the trunk at the foot of the bed. You will make your bed each morning with military precision. You will not speak after lights out, and you will not leave this room during the night for any reason." Timothy placed his small bag on the thin mattress and looked around the empty dormitory. "When will I meet the other boys?" The matron's expression darkened. "You will meet them when it is appropriate. For now, you need to understand the rules. Breaking any rule results in punishment. Severe infractions result in a visit to the cellar, where disobedient children learn the true meaning of discipline." The way she said cellar made Timothy's blood run cold. There was something in her tone, a satisfaction that suggested the cellar was not merely a place of punishment, but something far worse. "Now," the matron continued, "you will remain here until dinner. Use the time to familiarize yourself with your new surroundings and to reflect on how fortunate you are to have been given a home at Blackwood House. Many children are not so lucky." And with that, she left, closing the door behind her with a finality that made Timothy feel as though he had been sealed in a tomb. He sat on the edge of his assigned bed and looked out through the barred window at the grey ocean beyond. The waves crashed against the cliffs below with a violence that seemed to echo the turmoil in his young heart. As the afternoon wore on, Timothy began to notice things that filled him with growing unease. The silence was too complete. Even in an empty building, there should have been sounds of life somewhere. The creaking of floorboards, the distant murmur of voices, the ordinary noises that people make simply by existing. But Blackwood House was as quiet as a graveyard. More disturbing still were the scratches he found carved into the wooden frame of his bed. Looking closer, he realized they were letters, carved by small fingers over what must have been many nights. They spelled out words that made his blood freeze. "Help us, she kills." And most chilling of all, "We are still here." As evening approached and the light outside began to fade, Timothy heard the first sounds he had encountered since arriving. Footsteps in the corridor outside, slow and measured, accompanied by a soft, scraping sound, as if something were being dragged across the floor. The footsteps stopped directly outside his door, and Timothy held his breath, waiting. The door handle turned slowly, and Timothy's heart hammered against his ribs as he prepared to meet his fellow orphans. But when the door opened, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A line of children, 23 in total, filing silently into the dormitory. They moved with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes empty of all life and hope. But it was not their zombie-like demeanor that made Timothy scream. It was the fact that each child bore the unmistakable marks of violence, bruises that had never healed, cuts that still bled, and worst of all, the transparent quality of their skin that allowed him to see right through them to the wall beyond. The children of Blackwood House were dead, and they had been dead for a very long time. As Timothy's scream echoed through the dormitory, the ghostly children turned their hollow eyes toward him, and in unison they opened their mouths and spoke in voices like autumn wind through dead leaves. "Welcome to Blackwood House, Timothy. Now you can never leave." Timothy's scream died in his throat as the spectral children continued to file into the dormitory with their eerie mechanical movements. Each ghostly figure took their place beside a bed, standing at attention like soldiers awaiting orders. In the dim light filtering through the barred windows, Timothy could see the horrific details of their conditions more clearly. Burns that had never healed, broken bones that jutted at impossible angles, and wounds that continued to weep ethereal blood that never quite reached the floor. The child closest to Timothy appeared to be a girl of perhaps 10 years old, her blonde hair matted with what looked like dried blood, her small dress torn and stained. When she turned to look at him, Timothy saw that her neck bore the clear imprint of adult hands, as if she had been strangled. Her lips moved soundlessly at first, then gradually her voice became audible, though it sounded as if it came from a great distance. "I'm Sarah," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of years of suffering. "I've been here since 1878. The matron said I was too willful, too defiant. She taught me obedience in the cellar." Another child, a boy who couldn't have been older than 6, stepped forward. His small body was covered in what appeared to be bite marks, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "I'm Peter," he said, in a voice like wind through broken glass. "I tried to run away. The matron's dogs caught me in the woods. They were hungry." One by one, the ghostly children introduced themselves, each telling a tale more horrific than the last. There was Margaret, who had been locked in a freezing shed during a blizzard for stealing a piece of bread. Thomas, who had been pushed down the stairs for questioning why they never received letters from the outside world. Little Emma, barely 4 years old, who had been denied food for days because she cried for her mother. "But how?" Timothy managed to whisper, his voice shaking with terror and disbelief. "How are you here? How can I see you?" An older boy, perhaps 13, stepped forward from the back of the group. His name was William, and he had been at Blackwood House the longest. His ghostly form bore the marks of the most severe abuse, scars that crisscrossed his back, burns on his hands and arms, and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had seen too much evil in too short a life. "The matron isn't just cruel," William explained, his spectral voice carrying an authority that the others deferred to. "She's something else, something that feeds on suffering and fear. Every child who dies here becomes trapped, bound to this place by the evil that killed them. We can't move on, can't find peace because our deaths were so violent, so filled with terror and pain." Timothy looked around the dormitory with new understanding. The scratches on the bed frames, the oppressive atmosphere, the unnatural silence, it all made sense now. "How many children have died here?" 23 of us so far," Sarah answered sadly. "But there have been others who managed to escape before it was too late. The matron is very careful. She only takes children who won't be missed, orphans with no family to ask questions." "The authorities don't know?" Timothy asked desperately. William's ghostly laugh was bitter and hollow. "The matron has connections, money, influence. When children disappear from Blackwood House, the official records show they were adopted by families in distant states or died of natural causes. No one investigates too closely when it's just orphans." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The ghostly children immediately returned to their beds, lying down and becoming even more translucent, until they were barely visible in the dim light. Timothy quickly did the same, pulling the thin blanket over his trembling body, just as the door opened. Matron Blackwood entered carrying a kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. She moved slowly between the beds, her pale eyes scanning each one with the thoroughness of a predator checking her territory. When she reached Timothy's bed, she stopped and stared down at him for what felt like an eternity. "I trust you've had time to settle in, Timothy," she said in her cold, measured voice. "Tomorrow, you'll begin your education in the ways of Blackwood House. You'll learn that obedience is not just expected here, it's essential for survival." Timothy forced himself to remain still, to breathe normally, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. The matron's presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air, and he could smell that strange, sweet scent more strongly now, the smell of decay masked by lavender water. "Sleep well, child," the matron continued, her thin lips curving into what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "Tomorrow, we begin your real education." After she left, the ghostly children gradually became visible again. William sat up in his bed and looked directly at Timothy with eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom, despite his young appearance. "You have to understand," William said urgently. "The matron doesn't just kill us. She feeds on our fear, our pain, our despair. The longer she can keep us suffering, the stronger she becomes. Some of us have been here for years before we finally died." "But why can't you leave?" Timothy asked. "Why are you trapped here?" Sarah floated closer to his bed, her ghostly form shimmering in the moonlight. "The evil that killed us binds us to this place. We've tried to warn other children, to help them escape, but the matron's power is too strong. She can sense when we try to interfere." "However," William added with a glimmer of hope in his spectral eyes, "there might be a way. We've been watching, learning, waiting for the right moment. The matron's power comes from an object hidden somewhere in this house, something that anchors her evil to this place. If that object could be destroyed, we could find peace," Peter finished, his small voice filled with longing, "and no more children would have to suffer." Timothy felt a surge of determination despite his terror. These children had endured unimaginable horrors, and their only hope lay in his ability to do what they could not: move freely through the house as a living person, search for this mysterious object, and somehow destroy it. "What does this object look like?" Timothy whispered. "We don't know exactly," William admitted, "but we know it's old, very old, older than the orphanage itself. The matron brought it with her when she first came here 30 years ago. We think it might be in her private chambers on the 3rd floor, in the room she never allows anyone to enter." The thought of venturing into the matron's private domain filled Timothy with dread, but he knew he had no choice. If he didn't act, he would eventually join these ghostly children in death, and others would continue to suffer the same fate. "There's something else you need to know," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "The matron has helpers, things that aren't quite human anymore. They patrol the house at night, making sure no one leaves their assigned areas. If they catch you wandering where you shouldn't be..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Timothy could imagine what happened to children caught breaking the rules. "When should I try?" Timothy asked, surprised by his own courage. "Not yet," William advised. "You need to learn the house first, understand the routines, figure out when and where it's safe to move. The matron will be watching you closely for the first few days. She always does with new arrivals." As if to emphasize his point, they heard the matron's footsteps in the corridor again. Slower this time, more deliberate. She was making her rounds, ensuring that all was as it should be in her domain of suffering. "We'll help you as much as we can," Sarah promised. "We'll watch for the matron's helpers, warn you of dangers. But you have to be careful, Timothy. If she suspects what you're planning..." The footsteps stopped outside their door again, and once more the ghostly children faded from view. Timothy closed his eyes and tried to control his breathing as the door opened slightly. He could feel the matron's cold gaze upon him, studying him, perhaps sensing that something had changed in the dormitory's atmosphere. After what felt like hours, the door closed again, and the footsteps retreated down the corridor. But Timothy knew that this was just the beginning. The matron was suspicious, and he would have to be more careful than ever if he hoped to survive long enough to free these tortured souls and prevent other children from sharing their fate. As he lay in the darkness, listening to the ghostly whispers of his new companions, Timothy made a solemn vow. He would find the source of the matron's power, he would destroy it, and he would ensure that Blackwood House could never again be a place of suffering and death. But first, he had to survive the next day, and the day after that, and however many days it would take to learn the secrets of this cursed place. The ghostly children had waited years for someone like him to arrive, someone who could move freely, someone who could act where they could not. He would not let them down, no matter what horrors awaited him in the depths of Blackwood House. The real battle for the souls of 23 dead children was about to begin. Timothy's first full day at Blackwood House began before dawn with the harsh clanging of a bell that seemed to reverberate through his very bones. The ghostly children had vanished with the first rays of sunlight, leaving him alone in the dormitory with only the memory of their terrible stories and the fading echo of their whispered warnings. As he dressed in the rough grey uniform that had been left at the foot of his bed, Timothy tried to steel himself for whatever horrors the day might bring. The dining hall was a cavernous room with long wooden tables scarred by decades of use. Timothy was shocked to discover that he was not alone among the living. 12 other children sat at the tables, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 14. But something was terribly wrong with them. They moved with the same mechanical precision he had seen in the ghostly children, their eyes vacant and lifeless, their faces bearing the pallor of those who had given up all hope. "Sit," commanded a harsh voice from the front of the room. Timothy turned to see a man he hadn't encountered before, tall and gaunt like the matron, with yellowed teeth and hands that bore the same strange scars. "I am Mr. Grimsby, the matron's assistant. You will sit at the end of the table and speak to no one." Timothy took his assigned place and was served a bowl of thin gruel that tasted like dishwater mixed with sawdust. He tried to catch the eye of the other children, hoping for some sign of recognition or humanity, but they stared straight ahead as they ate, as if they were afraid to acknowledge his existence. The boy sitting closest to Timothy appeared to be about his own age, with dark hair and hollow cheeks that spoke of chronic hunger. When Mr. Grimsby turned away to speak with another adult, a woman with cruel eyes who seemed to be some sort of teacher, the boy leaned slightly toward Timothy and whispered without moving his lips. "Don't try to talk to us during the day," the boy breathed, his voice barely audible. "They're always watching. My name is Daniel. I've been here for 2 years. Meet me in the washroom after evening prayers if you can." Before Timothy could respond, Mr. Grimsby's attention snapped back to their table. His yellow eyes fixed on Timothy with an intensity that made the boy's skin crawl. "Is there something you wish to share with the group, new boy?" Mr. Grimsby asked, his voice dripping with menace. "No, sir," Timothy replied quickly, keeping his eyes fixed on his bowl. "Good. Remember that here at Blackwood House, we value silence and obedience above all else. Children who forget this lesson often find themselves in need of correction." The morning lessons took place in a classroom that felt more like a prison cell, with barred windows and walls covered in religious texts that spoke of sin, punishment, and the corruption of youth. The teacher, Miss Thornfield, was the cruel-eyed woman from the dining hall, and her lessons consisted primarily of reading passages about the inherent wickedness of children and the necessity of harsh discipline to drive out evil. "Children are born in sin," Miss Thornfield intoned, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "They are naturally inclined toward wickedness and disobedience. Only through strict discipline and constant vigilance can their corrupt natures be corrected." Timothy noticed that several of the children bore fresh bruises and cuts, evidence of the correction that Mr. Grimsby had mentioned. One little girl, who couldn't have been more than 6, had her left hand wrapped in dirty bandages, and Timothy could see dark stains that suggested the wound beneath was still bleeding. The afternoon brought manual labor, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and performing other menial tasks under the watchful eyes of the staff. Timothy was assigned to work in the kitchen with 3 other children, including Daniel. The kitchen was a hellish place, with massive iron stoves that radiated oppressive heat and cast dancing shadows on the walls. The cook, a massive woman with arms like tree trunks and a face twisted by years of cruelty, barked orders while wielding a wooden spoon like a weapon. "Move faster, you lazy wretches!" she shouted, striking one of the younger children across the shoulders when he stumbled under the weight of a heavy pot. The matron expects perfection, and perfection is what she'll get. During a brief moment when the cook stepped outside to retrieve more firewood, Daniel managed to whisper to Timothy while they scrubbed pots in the scalding water. "The living children you see are the ones who've learned to survive by becoming empty shells," Daniel explained rapidly. "They've given up fighting, given up hoping. It's the only way to avoid the worst punishments." "But you haven't given up," Timothy observed. Daniel's eyes flickered with a spark of the defiance that had once burned brighter. "I'm close. Every day it gets harder to remember who I was before this place. But I've seen things, Timothy. Terrible things that happen to children who displease the matron. And I've heard the others, the ones who died here, trying to warn us. You can see them too. Sometimes, late at night when the matron thinks we're all asleep. They try to help, but they're limited in what they can do. The evil that binds them to this place also prevents them from interfering too directly." The cook returned before they could say more, and the rest of the afternoon passed in oppressive silence. But Timothy's mind was racing. If Daniel could sometimes see the ghostly children, perhaps other living children could too. Maybe there was more resistance in this place than the staff realized. Evening prayers took place in a chapel that had been converted from what might once have been a library. The walls were lined with religious imagery that seemed designed to inspire fear rather than comfort. Paintings of hellfire, sculptures of suffering saints, and a massive crucifix that dominated the front of the room. The matron led the prayers herself, her cold voice reciting words about sin and punishment while the children knelt on the hard stone floor. "Oh Lord," the matron intoned, "we thank you for bringing these wayward children to our care. Help us to drive the wickedness from their hearts through whatever means necessary. Grant us the strength to be firm in our discipline, no matter how much they may cry or plead for mercy." Timothy felt sick as he realized that the matron was essentially asking for divine permission to torture children. The other children recited the responses mechanically, but Timothy noticed that several of them had tears streaming down their faces. After prayers, the children were marched back to their dormitories. Timothy waited until he heard the heavy footsteps of the staff retreating down the corridors before slipping out of his bed and making his way to the washroom. The building was not entirely silent. He could hear strange sounds echoing from the lower levels, sounds that might have been machinery or might have been something far worse. Daniel was waiting for him in the washroom, along with 2 other children Timothy hadn't expected, a girl of perhaps 12 named Lucy, and an older boy called Marcus, who appeared to be the eldest of the living children at around 14 years old. "We don't have long," Daniel whispered urgently. "The matron makes rounds every hour after lights out, but we needed to talk to you. You're different from the others who've come here," Lucy added, her voice barely audible. "Most new children are broken within days, but you still have fight in you." Marcus stepped forward, his face grave beyond his years. "We've been planning something for months, but we needed someone the matron hasn't broken yet. Someone who could take risks the rest of us can't." "What kind of risks?" Timothy asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The matron's private chambers," Daniel explained. "We think that's where she keeps whatever gives her power over this place. But it's on the 3rd floor, and none of us have ever been up there. The punishment for being caught in that area would be—" He didn't need to finish. Timothy had seen enough evidence of the matron's cruelty to understand what fate awaited children who broke the most serious rules. "The ghost children told me about this too," Timothy admitted. "They think there's an object up there, something old and evil that anchors the matron's power to this place." The other children exchanged glances. "So you can see them clearly?" Marcus asked. "We only catch glimpses, shadows, and whispers, but if they're communicating with you directly—" "They are," Timothy confirmed. "They want to help, but they're limited in what they can do. That's why it has to be one of us." Lucy pulled something from beneath her nightgown, a small piece of metal that had been sharpened to a point. "I've been working on this for weeks," she whispered. "It's not much, but it might be useful for picking locks or other things." "When would we try?" Timothy asked. "Tomorrow night," Marcus decided. "The matron always goes to her chambers after midnight rounds. That gives us a window of maybe 2 hours before she makes her next check. But how do we get past her helpers?" Timothy remembered Margaret's warning about the things that patrolled the house at night. "We've been watching them," Daniel explained. "They follow patterns, routes they take through the building. There are gaps, moments when certain areas are unguarded. It's dangerous, but it's possible." The sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside made them all freeze. They quickly dispersed, each returning to their dormitory as silently as shadows. Timothy slipped back into his bed just as the door opened and Mr. Grimsby's lantern light swept across the room. As Timothy lay in the darkness, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination, he felt the presence of the ghostly children returning. William's spectral form materialized beside his bed, his expression grave. "We heard," William whispered. "Tomorrow night could be your only chance. But Timothy, you need to understand. If you're caught, the matron won't just kill you. She'll make your suffering last for weeks, maybe months. And then you'll join us, trapped here forever." "I understand," Timothy replied silently, knowing the ghost could hear his thoughts. "But I can't let this continue. Too many children have already died." Sarah's ghostly form appeared on his other side. "We'll do everything we can to help you. We'll try to distract the matron's helpers, create diversions, but you have to be ready for anything." As the ghostly children faded back into the shadows, Timothy closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for what might be his last night alive. Tomorrow, he would venture into the heart of darkness that was Matron Blackwood's domain, and either he would find a way to end the evil that plagued this place, or he would become its next victim. The fate of 23 dead children and countless others who might come after rested in the hands of one frightened 8-year-old boy who refused to give up hope. The next day passed with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching like an eternity as Timothy tried to maintain the appearance of a broken, obedient child while his mind raced with plans and preparations. During morning lessons, he memorized the layout of the building as best he could, noting which floorboards creaked and where the shadows fell deepest. During afternoon chores, he observed the staff's routines, learning when they were most likely to be distracted or absent from their posts. The most difficult part was watching the other children suffer through another day of systematic abuse. During lunch, he witnessed Mr. Grimsby strike a 7-year-old boy across the face for dropping his spoon, leaving a handprint that would undoubtedly become a bruise. In the afternoon, he saw Miss Thornfield force a girl to stand in a corner for hours as punishment for asking to use the washroom during lessons. Each act of cruelty strengthened Timothy's resolve, reminding him why he had to succeed in his mission. As evening approached, Timothy noticed that the ghostly children were becoming more visible, even during daylight hours. William appeared briefly in the corridor during the march to dinner, his spectral form flickering like a candle flame as he mouthed words of encouragement. Sarah manifested in the chapel during evening prayers, her ghostly hand reaching out as if to touch Timothy's shoulder in support. The other dead children were gathering their strength for the night ahead, preparing to help in whatever way they could. After lights out, Timothy lay in his bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the matron's rounds. Her footsteps were as regular as clockwork. Down the corridor, pause at each door, continue to the next. He had timed her previous nights and knew that she would complete her circuit and return to her chambers by midnight. That would give him and the other living children their window of opportunity. At precisely midnight, Timothy slipped from his bed and made his way to the washroom where the others were waiting. Daniel, Lucy, and Marcus stood in the shadows like conspirators in some desperate rebellion, their faces pale but determined in the moonlight filtering through the barred window. "Are you ready?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Timothy nodded, clutching the small metal tool that Lucy had given him. "What about the matron's helpers?" "We've been watching them," Daniel explained quietly. "There are 3 of them that patrol at night. They're not quite human anymore. Something the matron did to them, we think, but they follow predictable routes. Right now, 1 is in the basement, 1 is on the 1st floor, and 1 is patrolling the grounds outside. That leaves the 2nd and 3rd floors clear for about 20 minutes, Lucy added. "But you have to move fast." Marcus handed Timothy a small candle stub and a match. "Light this only when you absolutely have to. The matron's chambers are at the end of the 3rd floor corridor, behind the door with the iron lock. We'll keep watch and create a distraction if anyone comes." Timothy took a deep breath and stepped into the corridor. The building felt different at night, more oppressive, more alive with malevolent energy. The very walls seemed to pulse with evil, and the shadows moved in ways that defied the laws of physics. As he made his way to the staircase leading to the upper floors, he felt the presence of the ghostly children around him. William's spectral form appeared at his side, moving silently up the stairs beside him. "The helpers are distracted," the ghost whispered, "but be careful on the 3rd floor. That's where the matron's power is strongest." The 2nd floor passed without incident, but as Timothy climbed toward the 3rd floor, the temperature seemed to drop dramatically. His breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost formed on the iron banister beneath his hand. The evil that permeated this place was concentrated here, focused like sunlight through a magnifying glass. The 3rd floor corridor was longer than those below, stretching into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Timothy could see the door at the far end, massive oak reinforced with iron bands, with a lock that looked like it belonged on a medieval dungeon. As he approached, he could hear sounds from within the chamber beyond, soft chanting in a language he didn't recognize, and beneath that, something that might have been weeping. The lock was more complex than anything Timothy had ever seen, but Lucy's makeshift tool proved surprisingly effective. As he worked, his hands shaking with cold and fear, he felt the ghostly children gathering around him. They couldn't touch the physical world directly, but their presence gave him strength and courage. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. Timothy paused, listening for any sign that he had been discovered, but the only sounds were the matron's continued chanting and that heartbreaking weeping. He pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, then closed it carefully behind him. The matron's chamber was a vision from the deepest pits of hell. The walls were covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, carved into the stone and filled with what appeared to be dried blood. Candles burned in iron sconces, their flames dancing with colors that didn't exist in nature. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something that reminded Timothy of the slaughterhouse his father had once taken him past in Portland. But it was the center of the room that made Timothy's blood freeze in his veins. Matron Blackwood knelt before an altar made of black stone, her arms raised toward an object that pulsed with malevolent energy. It was a box, perhaps 2 feet square, made of some dark metal that seemed to absorb light. Symbols covered its surface, writhing and shifting as if they were alive, and from within came the sound of weeping, the voices of children crying out in eternal torment. The matron herself had changed. Her human disguise had fallen away, revealing something that was only partially human. Her skin was pale as bone and stretched tight over a frame that was too tall and too thin. Her fingers had elongated into claws, and when she turned her head slightly, Timothy could see that her eyes had become completely black, like pools of infinite darkness. "Yes, my precious ones," the matron crooned to the box, her voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. Feed me your pain, your fear, your despair. Make me strong so that I can gather more of your kind, so that our family can grow ever larger." Timothy realized with horror that the box contained the souls of the children who had died at Blackwood House. Not just the 23 he had met, but countless others from decades past. They were trapped inside that cursed object, their eternal suffering feeding the matron's unholy power. As he watched, the matron reached into a bag beside the altar and withdrew something that made Timothy's stomach lurch. A child's finger, small and pale, bearing a ring that Timothy recognized as belonging to one of the living children downstairs. The matron placed it on the altar and began chanting more fervently, and the box pulsed brighter in response. Timothy knew he had to act quickly. The ghostly children had told him that destroying the box would free their souls and end the matron's power. But how could he destroy something that radiated such evil energy? As if reading his thoughts, William's spectral form appeared beside him. "The candle," William whispered urgently. "Light the candle and hold it against the symbols on the box. Our combined will, focused through the flame, might be enough to break the binding." Timothy struck the match with trembling hands, the tiny flame seeming impossibly bright in the chamber of horrors. The matron was so absorbed in her ritual that she didn't notice the small light behind her. But Timothy knew he had only moments before she sensed his presence. He crept forward, the ghostly children moving with him like a protective escort. Sarah, Peter, Margaret, and all the others materialized around the altar, their spectral forms growing brighter and more solid as they focused their will on the cursed box. "Now!" William commanded. Timothy lunged forward and pressed the candle flame against the largest symbol on the box's surface. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The box began to scream, not with one voice, but with hundreds, the anguished cries of every child who had ever suffered and died in this place. Light poured from the cracks that appeared in its surface, and the symbols writhed and twisted as if trying to escape the metal that contained them. The matron spun around with inhuman speed, her black eyes fixing on Timothy with murderous rage. "You!" she shrieked, her voice now completely inhuman. "What have you done?" But even as she lunged toward him with claws extended, the box continued to crack and fracture. The ghostly children were pouring their essence into the flame, using Timothy's living will as a conduit to finally break free from their prison. The light grew brighter and brighter until Timothy had to close his eyes against its intensity. The matron's scream of rage became one of agony as her power began to drain away. Timothy could feel her claws rake across his back, but the pain seemed distant and unimportant compared to the joy he felt radiating from the freed souls around him. With a sound like thunder, the box shattered completely. A pillar of pure white light erupted from its remains, piercing through the ceiling and reaching toward the heavens. The ghostly children were caught up in that light, their forms becoming brilliant and beautiful as they were finally freed from their torment. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, as her spirit began to ascend. "Thank you for giving us peace." One by one, the dead children rose into the light, their faces radiant with joy and gratitude. William was the last to go, pausing to look back at Timothy with eyes that held infinite compassion. "You did it," he said simply. "You saved us all." As the last of the spirits disappeared into the light, the matron collapsed to the floor, her inhuman form crumbling like ancient parchment. Without the power of the trapped souls to sustain her, she was revealed for what she truly was, a withered corpse that had been animated by evil for far too long. The chamber began to shake and crumble as the evil that had permeated Blackwood House for decades finally dissipated. Timothy stumbled toward the door, his mission complete but his strength nearly spent. Behind him, the altar cracked and fell, and the symbols on the walls faded into nothing. The nightmare was finally over, but Timothy still had to escape the collapsing building and ensure that the surviving children made it to safety. The hardest part of his ordeal was yet to come. The collapse of Matron Blackwood's power sent shockwaves through the entire structure of the orphanage. As Timothy stumbled from the chamber of horrors, the building around him began to shake and groan like a living thing in its death throes. The evil that had held Blackwood House together for decades was dissipating, and without that malevolent force, the physical structure itself was beginning to fail. Timothy raced down the corridor toward the staircase, his back burning from the matron's claws, but his spirit soaring with the knowledge that he had succeeded. The ghostly children were free, their souls finally at peace after years of torment. But his work wasn't finished. He still had to help the living children escape before the building collapsed entirely. As he reached the second floor, Timothy encountered the first of the matron's helpers, the inhuman things that had patrolled the orphanage at night. But like their mistress, the creature was already beginning to deteriorate. What had once been a man was now revealed as a shambling collection of bones and rotting flesh, held together only by the matron's will. As that will faded, the helper collapsed into a pile of dust and ancient clothing. Timothy found Daniel, Lucy, and Marcus waiting anxiously in the washroom, their faces pale with fear as the building shook around them. "What happened?" Daniel whispered urgently. "The whole place is falling apart." "I destroyed it," Timothy gasped, still catching his breath from his desperate flight. "The box that held the dead children's souls, it's gone. The matron is dead, and her power is broken." Lucy's eyes widened with hope and disbelief. "You mean we're free? Really free?" "We will be if we can get everyone out of here before the building comes down," Timothy replied. "We need to wake the other children and get them outside." Marcus was already moving toward the door. "I'll take the younger ones from dormitory A. Daniel, you and Lucy get the children from the other rooms. Timothy, can you manage the ones from your dormitory?" Timothy nodded, though his body was screaming with exhaustion and pain. They split up, racing through the corridors as chunks of plaster began falling from the ceiling and the very foundations of the building groaned ominously. In his dormitory, Timothy found the other living children huddled in their beds, terrified by the sounds of destruction around them. Many of them had been so broken by their experiences that they could barely comprehend what was happening. "Listen to me," Timothy said urgently, moving from bed to bed and shaking the children gently awake. "The matron is dead. We're getting out of here. You have to come with me now, or the building will collapse on us." Some of the children responded immediately, their survival instincts overriding their conditioned obedience. But others simply stared at him with vacant eyes, too damaged by their experiences to understand that salvation was at hand. Timothy made a difficult decision. He couldn't save everyone if he tried to convince each child individually. Instead, he grabbed the hands of the two youngest children, a boy and girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and began leading them toward the door. "Follow me," he called to the others. "Anyone who wants to live, follow me now." 6 of the 8 children in the dormitory responded, stumbling after him in their nightclothes as the building continued to shake around them. Timothy's heart broke for the 2 who remained, but he knew that trying to force them would only result in everyone's death. In the corridor, he met up with the others. Marcus had managed to gather 4 children from dormitory A, while Daniel and Lucy had rescued 6 more from various rooms throughout the building. In total, they had saved 16 of the living children. Not all, but more than Timothy had dared hope for. "The main entrance is blocked," Marcus reported breathlessly. "Part of the ceiling collapsed and sealed the doors. But there's a window in the kitchen that leads to the courtyard." They made their way through the disintegrating building, supporting the younger children and encouraging the older ones to keep moving. The kitchen was a disaster zone. Pots and pans scattered across the floor, the massive stoves overturned, and a gaping hole in the ceiling where part of the floor above had given way. But the window Marcus had mentioned was still intact, and it was large enough for even the older children to climb through. Timothy helped boost the younger ones up and out, then assisted the others as they escaped one by one into the cold October night. As the last child climbed through the window, Timothy heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the agonized screaming of Mr. Grimsby and the other staff members who had served the matron. Like the helpers, they were discovering that their connection to the evil that had sustained them was severed, and they were paying the price for their decades of cruelty. Timothy was the last to climb through the window, and as his feet touched the ground outside, he turned to look back at Blackwood House one final time. The building was collapsing in on itself, floors pancaking down as the walls buckled and fell. In the distance, he could see lights approaching, lanterns carried by people from the nearby town who had seen the strange pillar of light that had erupted from the orphanage and come to investigate. The 16 rescued children huddled together in the courtyard, many of them crying from relief, fear, or simple, overwhelming emotion. They had been prisoners for so long that the concept of freedom was almost incomprehensible. Timothy moved among them, offering what comfort he could, though he was just a child himself. "What happens to us now?" asked one of the older girls, her voice small and frightened. "I don't know," Timothy admitted, "but it has to be better than what we've escaped." The townspeople arrived within the hour, fishermen, shopkeepers and farmers, who had been awakened by the supernatural light and the sounds of destruction. They found the children wrapped in blankets they had taken from the collapsing building, watching as the last walls of Blackwood House crumbled into rubble. The leader of the group was a kindly-faced man named Samuel Morrison, who owned the general store in the nearby village of Millbrook. He took one look at the children's condition, their hollow eyes, their obvious signs of abuse and malnutrition, and immediately began organizing care for them. "Dear God," Morrison whispered to his companions, "what happened to these poor souls?" Timothy stepped forward, knowing that someone had to tell the truth about what had occurred at Blackwood House. "The matron was evil," he said simply. "She hurt children, killed them. 23 children died here over the years, and their spirits were trapped until tonight." The adults exchanged skeptical glances, but the evidence was hard to deny. The children's physical condition spoke of systematic abuse, and the supernatural destruction of the building suggested forces beyond normal understanding. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the town's physician, and one of the few women in the group, knelt down to examine the children. She was a progressive woman for her time, one of the first female doctors in Maine, and she had seen enough of the world to know that evil could take many forms. "These children need immediate medical attention," she announced, "and they'll need time to heal from whatever trauma they've experienced. But first, we need to get them somewhere warm and safe." The townspeople opened their hearts and homes to the survivors. Some families took in 1 or 2 children temporarily, while others organized clothing drives and food collections. The local church became a coordination center for the relief efforts, and within days, arrangements were being made for the children's long-term care. Timothy found himself staying with the Morrison family, who had no children of their own, and welcomed him with genuine warmth. For the first time in months, he slept in a real bed with clean sheets, ate meals that weren't gruel or stale bread, and experienced kindness without the threat of punishment. But even as his body began to heal, Timothy found himself haunted by memories of Blackwood House, not the terrible memories of abuse and fear, but the faces of the ghostly children who had finally found peace. In his dreams, he saw them ascending into that pillar of light, their expressions radiant with joy and gratitude. 3 weeks after the destruction of Blackwood House, Timothy was helping Mr. Morrison in the general store when a stranger arrived in town. He was a well-dressed man from Portland, claiming to be an investigator sent by the state to look into the orphanage's destruction. But Timothy sensed something familiar about him, something that made his skin crawl. That night, as Timothy lay in bed, he felt a familiar presence in his room. William's ghostly form materialized beside his bed, but the spirit looked different, more translucent, more peaceful, as if he were visiting from a great distance. "Timothy," William whispered, his voice like wind through autumn leaves, "we came to warn you. The man who arrived today, he's connected to the same evil that created the matron. There are others like her, other places like Blackwood House. The box you destroyed was just one of many." Timothy sat up in bed, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" "The evil that corrupted the matron is ancient and widespread," William explained. "It seeks out those who would harm children and gives them power in exchange for souls. You've won a great victory, but the war isn't over." Sarah's ghostly form appeared on Timothy's other side. "We can't stay much longer," she said sadly. "The light is calling us home, but we wanted you to know that you're not alone. There are others like you, children who have the strength to stand against this evil. You'll find them when the time is right." "Will I see you again?" Timothy asked, tears streaming down his face. "Not in this world," William replied gently. "But someday, when your time comes to cross over, we'll be waiting for you. Until then, remember what you've learned here. Remember that even the darkest evil can be defeated by courage, compassion, and the willingness to sacrifice for others." The ghostly children began to fade, their forms becoming more and more translucent until they were just wisps of light in the darkness. "Thank you," Sarah whispered as she disappeared. "Thank you for giving us peace." And then they were gone, leaving Timothy alone with the knowledge that his battle against evil was far from over. But he was no longer the frightened 8-year-old who had arrived at Blackwood House. He was a survivor, a warrior in the fight against darkness, and he would be ready when the next challenge came. Outside his window, the first light of dawn was breaking over the Maine coast, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was a new day, full of hope and possibility, and Timothy Hartwell faced it with the quiet confidence of someone who had looked into the abyss and emerged victorious. In the weeks that followed, the official investigation into Blackwood House proved to be a carefully orchestrated cover-up. The stranger from Portland, who Timothy now knew was connected to the same dark forces that had empowered the matron, filed a report claiming that the orphanage had been destroyed by a gas explosion caused by faulty equipment. The surviving children were described as traumatized by the accident, their stories of abuse dismissed as confused memories distorted by shock. But the people of Millbrook knew better. They had seen the supernatural light that had erupted from the building, had witnessed the way the structure had collapsed in on itself as if consumed by some internal force. More importantly, they had seen the condition of the children, the systematic abuse, the terror in their eyes, the way they flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell became the unofficial coordinator of the children's recovery. She documented their injuries, both physical and psychological, and worked tirelessly to help them heal. Under her care and the loving attention of the townspeople, most of the survivors began to show remarkable improvement. Daniel, who had been at Blackwood House the longest among the living children, struggled the most with adjusting to freedom. He would often wake screaming from nightmares, and it took months before he could bear to be touched without flinching. But gradually, with the patient care of the family that had taken him in, he began to remember what it felt like to be a normal child. Lucy proved to be remarkably resilient, her natural intelligence and determination helping her adapt quickly to her new life. She threw herself into her studies with Dr. Hartwell, who recognized her potential and began tutoring her in subjects far beyond what most girls her age were expected to learn. Marcus, as the oldest survivor, took on a protective role with the younger children. He made it his mission to check on each of them regularly, ensuring that they were adjusting well to their new homes and that no one was falling through the cracks of the community's care system. Timothy found himself in a unique position among the survivors. While the others had been broken by their experiences at Blackwood House, he had been strengthened by them. His encounter with the supernatural had awakened abilities he was only beginning to understand. A sensitivity to evil, an ability to see beyond the physical world, and most importantly, an unshakable determination to protect the innocent. As winter gave way to spring, Timothy began to notice things that others missed. He could sense when someone harbored dark intentions, could feel the presence of supernatural forces, and occasionally caught glimpses of spirits who had not yet found peace. It was as if his experience at Blackwood House had opened a door in his mind that could never be fully closed. One evening in late April, as Timothy was helping Mr. Morrison close the store, a woman arrived in town with 3 young children in tow. She claimed to be a widow seeking a fresh start, but something about her made Timothy's skin crawl. Her smile was too wide, her eyes too cold, and when she spoke to the children, there was an undertone of menace that reminded him all too clearly of the matron. That night, Timothy slipped out of the Morrison house and made his way to the boarding house where the woman was staying. As he crept closer to her window, he could hear her speaking in a low voice to someone or something that wasn't visible. "Yes, I understand," the woman was saying. "The boy who destroyed the Blackwood vessel must be eliminated. His interference cannot be allowed to continue." Timothy's blood ran cold as he realized that the forces behind the matron had tracked him down. But instead of fear, he felt a familiar surge of determination. He had faced evil before and won. He could do it again. Over the next few days, Timothy quietly gathered the other survivors and shared his suspicions. To his surprise, several of them had also sensed something wrong about the newcomer. Daniel had noticed that her children seemed unnaturally obedient and fearful, while Lucy had observed that the woman asked too many questions about the Blackwood House survivors. "What do we do?" Marcus asked during a secret meeting in the old barn behind the Morrison property. "We protect ourselves in the town," Timothy replied with a confidence that surprised even him. "We've learned things at Blackwood House that most people will never understand. We know how to recognize evil, and we know that it can be defeated." The confrontation came sooner than expected. 3 nights later, Timothy woke to find the woman standing in his bedroom, her false, kindly demeanor replaced by something far more sinister. In her hand, she held a knife that gleamed with an unnatural light, and her eyes had taken on the same black emptiness he had seen in the matron's gaze. "You should have died with the others, boy," she hissed, raising the blade. "Your meddling has cost us decades of work." But Timothy was no longer the helpless child who had first arrived at Blackwood House. As the woman lunged forward, he rolled aside and grabbed the oil lamp from his bedside table, hurling it at her with all his strength. The glass shattered against her chest, and the burning oil ignited her clothing. The woman's screams woke the entire household, but by the time Mr. and Mrs. Morrison reached Timothy's room, she had vanished, leaving only the smell of sulfur and the echo of inhuman shrieks. The next morning, the woman and her children were gone, having fled in the night. But Timothy knew this wouldn't be the last time he encountered the forces that had created places like Blackwood House. There were others out there, other institutions where children suffered and died to feed ancient evils, other servants of darkness who preyed on the innocent. As he stood on the cliffs overlooking the ruins of Blackwood House, Timothy made a solemn vow. He would dedicate his life to fighting this evil wherever he found it. He would seek out other children who had the strength to stand against the darkness, and together they would ensure that no more innocents would suffer as the 23 souls of Blackwood House had suffered. The wind from the ocean carried with it the faint sound of children's laughter, not the tortured cries of the dead, but the joyful voices of spirits, finally at peace. Timothy smiled, knowing that William, Sarah, Peter, and all the others were watching over him, blessing his mission and lending him their strength. The battle against evil was far from over, but Timothy Hartwell was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had learned that even the darkest forces could be defeated by courage, compassion, and the unbreakable will of those who refused to let innocence be destroyed. As he walked back toward town, Timothy felt the presence of the ghostly children one last time. Their voices carried on the wind like a benediction. "Go well, brave Timothy. Fight the good fight. And remember, you are never alone." Until the sun set over the Maine coast, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, and Timothy Hartwell walked toward his destiny as a guardian of the innocent, a warrior against the darkness, and a beacon of hope for all who suffered under the weight of evil. The haunted orphanage, where 23 children had met their grim fate, was now nothing but rubble and memory, but their sacrifice had not been in vain. Through their suffering and Timothy's courage, a new guardian had been born, one who would ensure that their story would never be repeated. The end. Important disclaimer. This story is completely fictional and was created exclusively for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, place names, and situations are products of imagination and do not represent real people, living or deceased, nor actual historical events. Any resemblance to reality is purely coincidental.